A 16-year-old boy sentenced to die in the electric chair with no proof. This is the case they wanted you to forget. Welcome back to Wealth and Wounds, where we tell the stories they tried to erase. If you believe in truth, justice, and amplifying voices that history silenced, subscribe right now and help us bring these stories to life. Because tonight, we're uncovering one of the most heartbreaking cases you've never heard of, a boy sentenced to die for a crime he didn't commit. The summer of 1948 was brutally hot in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. The air was heavy with the scent of coal smoke, and tensions in the small industrial town ran thicker than the humidity. In the shadow of towering smokestacks, Thomas Greene, a quiet 16-year-old black teen, lived with his grandmother in a tiny wooden house near the railroad tracks. Thomas wasn't like the other kids in town. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and dreamed of becoming a carpenter. His days were filled with odd jobs, fixing broken furniture for neighbors and sketching designs in a notebook he carried everywhere. But none of that mattered the night a young white woman, Margaret Sawyer, was found dead near the edge of the train tracks. Within hours, Thomas's name was in the sheriff's mouth. By morning, he was in handcuffs. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look for evidence. They wanted a suspect, and Thomas, quiet, poor, and black, was an easy target. Thomas's trial was over before it began. In the packed courtroom, all white jurors stared at him with cold, judging eyes. The prosecution had no physical evidence, no witnesses, no fingerprints. What they had was fear and a story. This boy, the prosecutor thundered, pointing at Thomas, is a danger to our women, a predator in our streets, and he must be punished. Thomas sat frozen, unable to comprehend the weight of what was happening. He barely understood the legal terms thrown around. His court-appointed attorney spoke little to him, only whispering once. Don't speak unless spoken to. Within 4 days, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty. Sentence. Death by electric chair. Thomas's grandmother collapsed in the courtroom, crying out his name as officers dragged him away. The judge's gavel slammed like a coffin lid. If this story breaks your heart, you're not alone. Stories like Thomas's are why we do this. Subscribe today, so history doesn't bury the truth again. Thomas spent months on death row in a small, windowless cell. The walls were damp, the air thick with mildew. The only light came from a flickering bulb overhead that buzzed like a trapped fly. Every day, guards passed his cell with food trays and whispers. Some mocked him. Not long now, boy. Thomas was terrified but clung to faith. He wrote letters to his grandmother, carefully folding them and slipping them through the bars to the mail cart. He sketched furniture designs in his notebook, imagining a life he'd never live. But outside the prison walls, his grandmother refused to give up. Miss Clara Greene was no ordinary woman. At 70 years old, her hands were calloused from decades of scrubbing floors for wealthy families. But her spirit was unbreakable. She knocked on every church door, pleaded with pastors, and begged lawyers to take her grandson's case. Most turned her away. It's hopeless, they said. No one will listen to a poor black woman. But Clara kept fighting. Her determination caught the attention of Eleanor Walsh, a young journalist from Philadelphia with a reputation for digging where others wouldn't. Eleanor agreed to visit Thomas in prison. When Eleanor sat across from Thomas in that cold, dim visiting room, she expected to see a hardened criminal. Instead, she saw a boy with wide, terrified eyes and trembling hands clutching a notebook full of furniture sketches. I didn't do it, Thomas whispered. His voice cracked like a child's. I know, Eleanor said softly. Eleanor started digging. She discovered the police had ignored key witnesses, including a railroad worker who saw a man in a gray trench coat near the tracks that night. She found forged signatures on Thomas's confession, written in handwriting that wasn't his. And she uncovered something explosive. Margaret Sawyer's own father had enemies in town, tied to a dispute over factory wages. As Eleanor published articles exposing the cracks in the case, tensions in Willow Creek exploded. White residents accused her of stirring trouble. Police officers followed her home. She received threatening letters, but she refused to stop. If they can kill Thomas, she wrote in one article, they can kill any child they choose. Justice must not bend to fear. For the first time, Thomas's story spread beyond the borders of Willow Creek. Civil rights activists and church leaders began organizing protests outside the courthouse. By the spring of 1949, national newspapers had picked up Thomas's story. Pressure mounted on the governor's office to review his case. But the local sheriff, desperate to protect his department, doubled down. "We've got the right man," Sheriff Dalton declared at a press conference. "Don't let outsiders tell us how to run our town." But Dalton was hiding something. Eleanor and Clara dug deeper, uncovering evidence that Dalton had ordered police to destroy files that might prove Thomas's innocence. They even found a witness, Samuel Price, a local bartender, who saw Dalton speaking with a man matching the suspect's description the night of the murder. Suddenly, the sheriff wasn't so confident. With national attention on the case, Thomas was granted a retrial. This time, Eleanor sat front row with Clara, while civil rights attorneys tore apart the prosecution story. They showed the forged confession. They revealed the missing witness statements. They exposed Dalton's cover-up. When Samuel Price testified about seeing Dalton with the suspect, the courtroom gasped. For the first time, Thomas saw hope. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Not guilty. Thomas broke down in tears as his grandmother clutched him. Eleanor stood, tears streaming down her face as the courtroom erupted. The sheriff resigned the next day. Dalton's role in the cover-up was exposed, leading to a federal investigation into the Willow Creek Police Department. Thomas walked out of prison a free man, but his life and his faith in justice was forever scarred. At a press conference, Thomas spoke softly but firmly. "They wanted to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. There are more boys like me in cells right now. I'm not the first. I won't be the last." His words echoed across the nation, fueling calls for legal reform. But as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Clara noticed a man in the crowd, a man wearing a gray trench coat. And in that moment, Clara knew this story wasn't over. That night, a letter arrived at Eleanor's apartment. It read, "Thomas may be free, but the game isn't over." Inside was a black and white photograph of another boy, this time younger, terrified, handcuffed. The cycle was repeating. Thomas Greene walked out of prison a free man. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and a small crowd of supporters cheered. But to Thomas, freedom didn't feel real. He had spent 3 years living under the shadow of death, counting every second, waiting for the sound of the cell door to open and the guards to take him to the electric chair. Now he was outside those gates, but he didn't feel safe. "They don't just let you go," he whispered to his grandmother, Clara. "They watch. They wait." Clara wrapped her arms around him, but even she could feel it, the sense that someone was still watching. That night, as they settled into Clara's small house, Eleanor Walsh, the journalist who saved Thomas's life, arrived with a package. Inside was a single photograph. A boy, no older than 14, sat in handcuffs on the steps of courthouse. His face was pale with fear. Scrawled on the back of the photo in black ink, "You're not done." Eleanor's hands shook as she placed the photo on the table. "Someone is sending a message." Clara nodded solemnly. "It's him," she said, "the man in the gray coat." Clara had seen him once before, in the crowd outside the courthouse during Thomas's retrial. A tall man with a gray trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat, face hidden in shadows. He had been watching Thomas. Now it seemed he was back. Eleanor started digging. She traced the photograph's origin to a local post office, but couldn't find a name or return address. The boy in the photo wasn't identified. "Whoever this is," Eleanor said, "they want us scared." Thomas sat silently, staring at the picture. He felt a wave of guilt. "That was supposed to be me," he murmured. "They're doing it again." The days that followed were tense. Strange cars parked near Clara's house. Anonymous letters arrived with phrases like "stay quiet" and "let it go." Eleanor wasn't deterred. "They tried to kill your story once. We're not letting them bury this boy too." But Thomas struggled. The trauma of prison still haunted him. He woke up sweating at night, reliving the sound of keys turning and guards shouting. He wanted to disappear. Clara, however, refused to let fear win. She'd already saved Thomas once. She wasn't going to stop now. Eleanor's investigation uncovered a name: David Bell, 14 years old, arrested for allegedly stealing from a general store. But the police file was sealed, which was unusual for a petty theft case. When Eleanor pushed for answers, she found out why. David had been accused of attacking the store owner's daughter. There was no evidence, but in a town like Willow Creek, David didn't stand a chance. "They're setting him up the same way they set me up," Thomas said bitterly. Eleanor, Clara, and Thomas returned to Willow Creek to investigate. The town hadn't changed much since Thomas's trial. Same brick courthouse, same rusty train tracks. But this time whispers followed them. At a diner, a waitress leaned over and whispered, "Careful who you talk to. They don't like folks digging here." Later that night, Clara noticed a figure in a gray trench coat leaning against a lamppost outside their hotel. He didn't move. He just watched. Through courthouse archives, Eleanor uncovered something chilling. The same sheriff who covered up Thomas's case years earlier, Sheriff Dalton, had ties to David Bell's case. Though Dalton had resigned after the scandal, his deputies were still in power. And the store owner accusing David? He was Dalton's cousin. "It's the same playbook," Eleanor muttered. "They're railroading another boy." Thomas clenched his fists. "Not again. Not while I'm alive." Eleanor reached out to civil rights groups that had supported Thomas's case. This time, they came prepared with lawyers, activists, and media coverage. But every step forward came with danger. The gray trench coat man followed them everywhere. Clara's tires were slashed. A rock was thrown through their hotel window with a note: "Leave before it's too late." Thomas, though terrified, stood firm. "They took years from me. I won't let them take David too." Late one night, a man knocked on their door. It was Samuel Price, the bartender who testified against Dalton. "You're being watched," he whispered. "That boy is next. The sheriff's men, they want to make an example." Samuel handed Eleanor a stack of papers, sealed police records. Among them were photos of David's arrest, his swollen face, bruises, and torn clothes. "They beat him until he signed a confession," Samuel said. "Same as Thomas." With proof in hand, Eleanor and her team planned to expose the corruption. They arranged a press conference to reveal the evidence. But the night before, the hotel's fire alarm went off. As smoke filled the halls, Thomas grabbed Clara and ran outside, only to see the man in the gray trench coat standing across the street. This time, he tipped his hat and walked away. The next morning, Eleanor stood at a podium with Clara and Thomas at her side. She held up the photos of David Bell, the sealed records, and the connection to Sheriff Dalton's men. "This is not justice," she declared. "This is a system built to destroy boys like Thomas and David, and we will not be silent." Reporters swarmed, snapping photos. The story exploded across the country. Civil rights leaders demanded David's release, and the governor was forced to intervene. Within weeks, David was freed. Charges were dropped. The deputy sheriff was placed under investigation. Willow Creek was once again in the national spotlight. But Thomas couldn't celebrate. The victory felt hollow, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man in the gray trench coat watching him. "He's still out there," Thomas whispered to Eleanor. "This isn't over." One evening, Clara received a letter in her mailbox. It was written in elegant handwriting. "You're brave, but bravery has consequences. Stop digging, or the next funeral will be yours." Attached was a photograph of Eleanor, taken from across the street. Thomas grabbed the letter, his hands shaking. "They're coming after her." That night, as Eleanor drove home, she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror. The car followed her for miles through winding country roads. Her heart pounded as she tried to lose it. Suddenly, the car sped up, swerving dangerously close. She grabbed her phone to call Thomas, but before she could dial, the headlights vanished. She pulled over, trembling. And then she saw it. A gray trench coat draped over her mailbox at home. The message was clear. This story is about more than Thomas or David. It's about power, corruption, and a system that thrives on fear. Like, comment, share this video, and subscribe to Wealth and Wounds. Because if we don't tell these stories, they'll keep happening.